Good morning, everyone. Good evening, depending on where you are. Uh, Today, we are delighted to have Professor Sarah Wheeler and Professor Alex Zuo presenting the interesting work on bargaining power and water market in Australia. Thanks all for being here. The title of our presentation today is Identifying Bargaining Power in Murray-Darling Basin Temporary Water Markets. What I would do, the format is I kick off with the introduction of the speaker, and then today we're talking about the introduction of, I have Sarah's bio, then I will introduce Sarah, but Alex will also, before he steps in, introduce himself. Sarah is a professor of water economics and she leads the Water, Environment and Food Economic Policy Group in the College of Business, Government and Law at Flinders University, right, in South Australia. She is a past president and distinguished fellow of the Australasian Agricultural and Resource Economic Society, as well as a fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia. She was an ARC Future Fellow and has over 150 peer-reviewed outputs in the research areas of irrigated farming, climate change, organic farming, water markets, water scarcity, mental health, and food waste. As you can see, we're really happy to have her here. She is an accomplished colleague in the field, and we are pretty much looking forward for her presentation today. What I'm going to do, Sarah, is I will hand over to you and Alex. You guys, you have, let's say, between 25 to 35 minutes, and then we open up for questions and answers. Thanks, over to you.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much, Djiby, for that introduction, and thank you for inviting us to come along and present some of our work. So today you've got two of us today because we're going to talk about a paper that we've been working on for a while, but we're still working on it. It's pretty complex and we're still trying to get it right. So appreciate your feedback here today. So my colleague Alec, he's the lead author on this paper. Alec, would you mind just doing a quick introduction of yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Alec Zuo. I'm a professor in the College of Business, Government and Law at Flinders University. So I'm also a member of the Food Economics Policy Group here with Sarah. Yeah, my main area is agricultural resources and water economics. So very happy today and presenting our work with Sarah. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Alec. And I'd like to acknowledge our other co-author on this publication, Dr. David Tang, who he can't be with us because he's currently on leave. So yes, I'm bringing you this on the lands of the Kaurna people in Adelaide in South Australia, and it's early evening here, so we're all a bit tired from a long day, but it'll be all good. So happy to take questions as we go along, though I may not see them. It might be easier to kind of leave it to the end. Okay, so I thought it would be good, but given that this is an international talk and lots of you potentially don't know much about the Australian situation or water markets in Australia. So I'm going to give an overview of Murray-Darling Basin and and water rights and water market and water policy within the Murray-Darling Basin. And then we're going to focus on the paper that we're going to talk about today. That's trying to investigate and identify bargaining power in two main states in the Murray-Darling Basin, New South Wales and Victoria, and we'll be focusing on temporary water markets. So the Murray-Darling Basin, it's a very important kind of almost known as Australia's food bowl within Australia. It covers a large area. It's hydrologically connected. It goes from the bottom of the state of Queensland through a lot of New South Wales to the top of Victoria and down through South Australia. So where the River Murray basically flows out at the Coorong and the Lakes End. It supports over 2 million people. It has over 7,000 irrigated agricultural businesses in there, produces about $22 billion of food and fibre annually. And it's historically been an area that suffers from severe climate kind of fluctuation. So we're a land of droughts and flooding rains, and our rivers and inflows into our rivers often show this. The graph that is highlighting before is just highlighting this in terms of years where we've had a lot of rain in the system and then years where we've had significant drought. Some of the biggest droughts in the last 20 years has been the Millennium Drought of the 2000s. It prompted a lot of water reform, and New South Wales has also just had what's known as the Tinderbox Drought from 2016 to 2019. So that's kind of the scene of the Murray-Darling Basin. And because water has been so important to Australia as a very dry country and trying to share between all those states that rivers flow through, there's been lots of different phases of water policy in the Murray-Darling Basin as Australia's kind of colonial population expanded. So in the very beginning, I need to acknowledge that the First Nations were here for over 60,000 years managing our water resources and did it, but what many would say, a lot more sustainably than we currently do today. But in terms of kind of colonial water history, you've got European settlement from 1800s on, which is known as kind of the exploratory phase, moving into the expansionary and development phase up to the 1980s. So this is where we built a lot of dams, gave out a lot of irrigation licenses, and set up a lot of irrigation districts across that Murray-Darling Basin. From the 80s onwards, that's when Australia first had significant issues with both water quality and water quantity, and rather than just turning to dams and irrigation infrastructure as a way to kind of address scarcity, Australia started looking at demand management a lot more. So this is where the first phases of water market development came in. Water pricing also expanded within this area. So this is known as the maturation and scarcity phase. And moving on to from the 2000s onwards is known as kind of transitions towards environmental sustainability. And this is where some of you may know that we implemented the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, which is integrally kind of focused with water markets as well. So that's just a little bit of an overview of water policy within the basin. As part of these changes in water policy, the most important kind of water policy change that has allowed water markets to exist within the basin is the unbundling of water rights. So before water reform from the basically 1990s onwards, water rights and water and land were attached. So if you sold your land, you sold your water right with it if you were in an irrigation district. And after unbundling, this basically allowed water to be separated from land, and you ended up with a number of different kind of rights. So you had your water entitlement access right, which is like your ownership, and I'll talk about it in the next couple of slides. You had delivery shares, and you had water use licenses, which were still attached to land. But what this meant is that water could be sold separately from land, allowing more effective water markets to exist. I'm just going to talk about this very briefly, but water entitlements, this is known as an ongoing entitlement to a share of water. It's also called, when you trade this, it's called a permanent trade. It's like selling your house rather than renting your house. And there's fees attached to water entitlement shares, etc. And water allocations. Water allocations is like your seasonal water right attached to your entitlement, and that can change each year. It's highly dependent on the seasonal year, and this it's something when the water season starts, irrigators, depending on the type of water entitlement they own, and there's over 150 different water entitlements in the basin, and they all have different sorts of entitlements and rights. And depending on that, you get a specific allocation. It's updated fortnightly. If it's a very dry year, that allocation might start at 0%. So you're not guaranteed getting any water that year. And then it's updated every fortnightly from that point on. Higher security entitlements are much more likely to get their full allocation each year, while general security might only get it 70 years in 100, and low security might only get it 30 years in 100, get their full entitlement. So there's quite a bit of difference between different entitlements and water allocations within the basin. This is just some maps highlighting both within the southern part of the basin, the different flows and the irrigation regions in the top left-hand figure, and the figure on the bottom right is highlighting trading zones. So for water markets to exist within the basin, there's a number of different trading zones which dictate where and when water can be traded to. So it is based on hydrological constraints and where water can go. And that figure is just highlighting some of those trading zones, and also highlighting for a particular year, namely 2016-17, where water market movements actually occurred within the southern Murray-Darling Basin. So that's just a little bit of background information about water markets. The other thing to note about the basin is that you know, it has very different regions and different irrigators and different types of water use right across the basin. So it's often kind of talked about the northern part of the basin versus the southern part of the basin. And the northern part of the basin is a lot more similar. So you've mainly really got cotton irrigators in the northern part of the basin. There's fewer of them. They have much higher water entitlement ownership. And in the southern Murray-Darling Basin, it's quite different. You've got a quite large mix of both permanent and annual agriculture. So in particular, you've got grapes and olives and almonds that need, you know, they need pretty consistent water use each year to be able to keep their trees alive. Whereas you've also got rice irrigators, mainly in New South Wales, who can be a lot more flexible in their water use, and in years where they get their full water entitlements, because they're the ones who generally tend to own the general and low security entitlements, then they can increase their acreage considerably. So that's kind of the key difference to bear in mind. And the other point is that southern Murray-Darling Basin has much more of the trade, especially temporary trade. So It has about 85% of the temporary trade within Australia, which makes it a much higher temporary trader. The Northern Basin has much less temporary trade, but they have about 40% of permanent trade. So water markets, there is a difference between, I often talk about formal and informal water markets. And informal water markets, so this is where there is no official rules or regulations about where and when water is moving to and how it's controlled. Informal water markets are said to have first started in the World War II drought in Australia, where irrigators were just swapping water between themselves. So that's the first known occurrence of water markets in Australia. And you know, when we hit the 1980s, when we had that kind of realization we couldn't just keep giving out water licenses or building dams to get ourselves out of trouble, this is when, you know, demand management first kicked in, and there was more kind of pilots and early facilitation of temporary trade, especially in New South Wales and South Australia, and then in Victoria. The 90s, which saw the further water reforms. This is where more formal water trading rules, etc., were introduced, and especially the National Water Initiative in the 2000s set up a lot more rules and ways to try and facilitate formal water markets within Australia. So, you know, part of that was the unbundling of water. And so once water was unbundled, this allowed irrigators to kind of sell part of their water license, which they couldn't do before, or they could sell all their water license, still remain on the farm and buy in temporary water, for example. So that's facilitated the movement and the increase of water market adoption over time. So we have, as I've been talking about, we've got really two main water market products, temporary transfers, which is known as water allocation trading, and permanent transfers, which is known as water license or water entitlement trading. The figure here is a recent kind of updated graph that we have for one of the biggest irrigation districts in Victoria. And it's always been one of the biggest water market traders in the whole basin. And it highlights both volumes of trade for both permanent and temporary trade, and also prices over time. So, you know, the thing to most kind of that highlights here is that temporary water prices, which is kind of that pink purple line, it's be highly variable. It can go from, you know, really just over less than $1 a megalitre to in some drought periods it hits over $1,000 a megalitre. And then when it floods, prices really do respond very, very quickly in the market and fall correspondingly. So the temporary market is highly variable, and volumes of trade in the temporary market are also a lot larger than the permanent market, because obviously you're only selling a seasonal right rather than your permanent right. Whereas the prices of prices of permanent water market products, they also tend to be variable over time, just not as volatile as temporary trades. So permanent trades have increased over time. They also increase in periods of drought, but they also decrease after when in times where there's not high water scarcity. So that's highlighting how water markets, especially this is mainly rural water markets, work in Australia, and how they can have quite variable prices for water for irrigators to buy or sell. This figure is highlighting, again, this is the whole southern Murray-Darling Basin, so trade volumes in the permanent and temporary space. and the lines are highlighting adoption of water market trade by irrigators. And this is just highlighting that irrigators were much more likely to adopt temporary water markets than they were to adopt permanent market trade. So, and again, this makes sense because you can go in and make a trade seasonally, whereas if you sell your permanent right, or if you're selling all of it, it's a permanent trade, and you're often either leaving irrigation or leaving farming altogether. This is just a bit of a comparison because people often ask me, you know, how similar is water markets to other innovations, and you know, if we compare it to the classic hybrid corn diffusion example, you know, water markets are pretty similar in terms of, you know, you go through a period of very, very low adoption in Australia, and then you have slight increasing adoption, and then rapid adoption of water markets as a tool for adaptation, and then kind of a slowing over time as more and more people have already adopted it. Okay, so, you know, in terms of, you know, what do water markets bring? What are the benefits? There's 3 distinct forms of economic efficiency: allocative, dynamic, productive efficiency. And what we also know from studies that have been that have quantitatively studied water markets is that water scarcity is the main driver of water prices. So whether it be drought or low water allocations or low dam storages, etc., all these things are very strongly, significantly associated with movements in water markets, and they're more so associated with temporary markets than permanent, but they're still associated, still drivers of permanent water markets. There's, you know, water markets, even though, you know, we've just talked about all the potential benefits that they do bring irrigators within Australia, there's also been lots and lots of criticism and concern about them. And this is a paper I wrote a few years ago that tried to summarise some of these concerns and what people would seem to be worried about the most. The first fundamental disagreement is that, you know, water markets and trading water is immoral. You shouldn't do it. You know, it's a public good and it should be free for everyone. So, you know, we can agree to disagree on that one, but that is a fundamental disagreement that is never going to go away. The second one is that water markets can't account for environmental, social and cultural values, which is very highly integrated with the criticism one. The third one is that water trade decreases farm profitability and creates other negative farm community impacts. And the fourth main criticism was that, you know, water markets, because of this unbundling of water from land, it allows non-irrigators and non-traditional stakeholders to own water. And then because you have these non-irrigators owning water, people get worried about collusion and cardholder behaviour and how it may influence water markets per se. So, you know, there are areas of market failure and equity. You know, as economists, we worry about things such as imperfect competition, and there is definitely issues being raised about how water brokers behave, how certain traders behave. Areas in the Northern Basin where you've got potential problems with some irrigators owning a lot of water and unregulated entitlements and lack of monitoring and compliance, etc. You've got problems there. Negative externalities. When you're moving water around, you have to worry about if there's environmental externalities from moving that water, and do we have to be worried about upstream, downstream things. Information asymmetry. Whether some traders, some brokers have better data and information than others, if there's insider trading, all those things, whether it's causing problems for information asymmetry. And obviously property rights distribution, which we've already touched on before. Even though First Nations were here for a very long time before us, for a number of reasons, they don't own pretty much any water. They have less than 0.2% of surface water entitlement. So this is a distributional issue that definitely needs fixing in water markets. Because of all these criticisms, and especially the tinderbox drought in New South Wales from 2016 onwards, and all the complaints about water markets when prices started rising again, this led to the ACCC, which is the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, doing a very thorough review of water markets to try and work out if there's any problems with people's behaviour and whether they were having an influence on water markets. And their report did recommend a number of reforms, etc., that was needed. And even though it didn't come up, and it wasn't able to quantify potential bargaining power or any direct influence, they said there was the potential for it to happen. And so that's why they suggested the need for reform in institutions and legislation governing water markets. And a lot of this was then implemented in a water legislation Commonwealth amendment in 2023. So this leads us, all this kind of backgrounds. I wanted to give you this background to kind of understand why we tried to do this paper. So, you know, we know that in efficient markets, you know, and especially highly liquid markets, bargaining should be absent. But we also know irrigation water is, you know, its value is highly localised, especially within the Murray-Darling Basin. It's used for all different things. And we also know that we have a range of different non-users entering the water market, and there's questions over that. So because of these kind of other non-traditional stakeholders, and some of these include superannuation companies, corporate financial investors, even environmental organisations, urban organisations, etc. So when it comes to things such as water markets, especially when you think about a lot of them, many irrigators are very small family irrigators who, you know, have limited time and limited resources. We know that there's potentially information asymmetry. There might be imperfect competition. There's definitely problems of thin markets, especially in the north, and transaction fictions also potentially exist. So, you know, when we use this term bargaining power, we're really using it as a combination of both of locational and water entitlement factors, but also information asymmetry, imperfect competition, transaction fiction. So that's what we're trying to estimate in our quantitative models here. When investigating bargaining in water markets, we're not the first to do it. There is a range of other international literature, both in the US, in Chile, in China, and in India. Within Australia, we had a PhD student who tried to investigate whether there was any evidence of insider trading in water markets, and he basically suggested that, well, there was a potential before there was rules enforced about insider trading in 2014, there's a potential it might have existed within Australia. So we are building on a number of other studies in this space. As I said, you know, there's unbundling has allowed these non-users to come in, and the current estimate, like it is actually, it's really hard to get estimates on non-users and financial investors within water markets, because that sort of information is not public. I'll talk about how we got our data in a second. But studies, when state governments do study on this, the latest estimate was in Victoria that corporate non-landholders were at 16% ownership of water entitlements in 2018. So that fraction of 16% has been slowly increasing, and it is unclear what it currently is in 2025. So our research is to identify the influence of cellar and biocharacteristics in the Murray-Darling water market in the context of hedonic price models. We use a range of different bio and cellar characteristics that we have access to. We don't have access to all their characteristics, like we don't know what sort of farm they are, but we do know what water entitlement they have, so therefore we know their monthly allocation rate, and we know what sort of owner they've been classified as by state governments. So I'll talk about that in the next slide, about all the different type of ownership types. And we also know, because we know their area, we know things such as over time, temperature, rainfall, groundwater salinity, locational factors, etc. So the main question that we're trying to work out is whether the non-use stakeholders, the financial investors, the owners not tied to land, do they have more bargaining power than other users in the water market? And by doing so, controlling for as many other factors as possible. So I'll finish the slide and hand over to Alec for the method next, but this data has come from New South Wales and Victoria State Water Registers. It's not publicly available. We had to negotiate for it for many years. We had to sign a lot of contracts, and they provided individual daily water temporary allocation trade data. So we're only looking at the temporary market. Trades for New South Wales from 2009 to 2020. This was about 23,000 observations. And in Victoria, we got 2008 to 2023. Because Victoria has a much larger water market, that was over 125,000 observations. So we also knew the trader locations, which was postcodes for New South Wales and trader, and then that's how we coded a lot of our variables. And it's also worth noting that even though we got these data from the state water registers, there's still significant problems in the database that we had to deal with. We have missing variables. We have, obviously, sometimes prices are not recorded. Sometimes they don't have to record the price, so they don't put it in there. Other times prices are, wildly out of any reasonable range. And some of the other problems we had, especially for Victoria, is where you have trades going across states. Victoria didn't have the information about where that water trade was going. So we have the information in the New South Wales data set, but we don't have the information in the Victorian data set. So that meant, really, for consistency, because we were doing the two states, we could only model Victoria. Both of them we modelled on intrastate data only, i.e. trades within the state. But we did sensitivity analysis on the New South Wales situation to say, okay, once we shove in the states that go interstate to another state, how similar are our results? And if we get time, we can talk about that. All right, Alec, I am did you want to do this, Alec? Or
yeah, I can continue with this. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. So, so this shows the participation participants in the water market, temporary water markets we studied. As you can see, these two states have different definitions, and they have some similarities. And in New South Wales, there is a very clear definition for financial investor. So hold water right without being an irrigator. So mostly they use water for asset and diversification purposes in their portfolio. And in Victoria, we don't have a clear definition for this type of owner. We can only have like without use type. So these are the owners who own water that is not tied to the irrigation land, but there are so now there are also irrigators who own water and that are not tied to land. So there is not very clear definition. That's why we say that the percentage of trade for this classification is substantially higher, like 41% of seller and 21% of buyer, which is much higher than the purely financial investor percentage of trade in New South Wales. So one of our main interests is to look at whether one type of trader has advantages over another type of trader in terms of the difference of price they can get in the market. So the next slide shows the method we use to estimate the price differences associated with different seller and buyer characteristics. So our model framework is the hedonic price model. And so price of each water transaction is a function of attributes of water, which is the shadow price of water, and also the comparative bargaining power, or is from information asymmetry, etc. So this is additional term in the function. And the additional term bargaining power is likely to correlate with trader characteristics. And so this is written as equation 1. And if we plug equation 1 into the main price equation, then we have equation 2. Further, the water attributes can be divided into observed and unobserved trends to us. So we have equation 3. And also assume that the shadow prices of the unobserved trends are also associated with the characteristics of the trading parties, sellers and buyers. Then we have equation 4 and plug equation 4 into the previous equation 2. Then we have equation 5, which shows that price is a function of the observable trend of the water and also the characteristics of seller and buyer. And next slide, please. And so in order to estimate the price differences associated with trader characteristics, we have to have two assumptions. First is the symmetric bargaining power, which means the coefficient B sell is plus the coefficient B buy is equal to 0. So this just implies the same trader will have the same bargaining power either as seller or buyer. And this is expected because in the water market, a buyer can, like a owner or a trader can be either a buyer or seller without much friction. So they can switch, even in the same season, they can switch from buyer to a seller or vice versa. And then the second assumption is symmetric demand. which means the coefficient D cell is equal to coefficient D bar in equation 5. So this means the same trader will have the same evaluation for the same product, either as seller or buyer. And because of these two assumptions, then we can simplify equation 5, and so it will turn to equation 6, and then this can be estimated by OAS, and the coefficient here, B, will measure the differences between how the differences between seller and buyer characteristics affect outcome and price in each of the transactions we observe. Next slide, please. The variables we use for the OAS, the differences variable. So we have differences between buyer and seller in terms of their percentage of water they receive from their water rights. So this is called monthly allocation rate. So it is a percentage. And then we have the ownership types, which are a series of dummies, as we have shown in the table previously. And then we also have differences in buyer and sellers and rainfall and their temperature experienced at the time of the trade, and then also their groundwater salinity in their area of buyer and seller. So these differs by seller and buyer according to their location of their location. And the other control variables we have is the volume of each trade. And we also control for the timing of the season of the trade and market competition in terms of number of trades in one, how concentrated the trades are in the previous month, and the trend of the price, which is average market price in the previous months. And then we have the Barmer choke dam storage volume, which are special characteristics of the water market in Australia, which we need to control for. And then we have the North-South Basin coding for New South Wales, because it is across the two basins, North and South. Next slide, please. So these are the preliminary results summary. So in terms of the differences, seller minus buyer variable, we have room for not significantly different, and we have temperature, which is only for Victoria, and then we have ground salinity for both New South Wales, Victoria, and then we have allocation only for New South Wales, significant. So this is summary of a series of model we have estimated, and next slide will be a better description of what we derived from the modeling findings. So for New South Wales, we find that financial investors have advantage over other type of owners in the temporary water market, because they can sell water at a premium, particularly compared with environment and industrial owners. The premium of they have is around 12 to 13%, and for private irrigators, it's around 10 to 11%, and for irrigators in irrigation districts is about 8 to 9%. And also we did the additional models for New South Wales, including the interstate trades, and the results stay the same regarding financial investor and regarding the premium of financial investors over environment and irrigation districts, but less so than for the over private irrigators. For Victoria, because without use category includes financial investors and also owners that whose water is not tied to land, and therefore we do not have a clear cut for the price premium regarding this ownership type. So they have 4% premium than private diverters and 1% than water corporations and urban water users, and 5%, but they have 5% lower. So it's a price discount compared with environment owners, and 6% price discount compared with district user irrigators. So this is the ownership findings. And in terms of other variables, the temperature differences, as we have seen from the summary table, it is positive and significant for Victoria. So this suggests that sellers' bargaining power, sellers have bargaining power over buyers if sellers' temperature is higher than buyers at the time of trade, and this is due to mostly a supply constraint, because higher temperatures in sellers' area will constrain sellers' ability to supply more water in the market, and hence they would have a bargaining power over sellers. And in terms of rainfall, we don't observe any obvious significant bargaining power in either New South Wales or Victoria. And in terms of water allocation percentage, so it is positive in New South Wales. Higher allocation for sellers over buyers will increase the sellers' power. And in terms of groundwater salinity, in Victoria, it is negative. In both states, it's negative and significant, which means higher salinity differences reduce sellers' bargaining power. And this is mostly due to the demand side factor, because when sellers has a relatively higher salinity, groundwater salinity than buyers are more likely switch to groundwater and will reduce the demand of surface water and reduce the bargaining power of sellers. And the control variables for Barmah choke and location, we observe that in Victoria there's a 4 to 6 percentage higher water prices when the choke was closed, but in upstream New South Wales, it is positive but insignificant. And in the northern basin in New South Wales, usually it is has a higher price over the southern basin, about 4 to 7% higher due to the disconnectivity of the northern basin. Next, over to you, Sarah.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Alec. All right, I'll summarize quickly because I can see we're running out of time. So this is the first study in Australia to try and work out whether we can identify bargaining power, and in particular, you know, trying to say, do the financial investors in New South Wales and then the without use owners in Victoria, do we see them having an advantage? And, you know, one of the things that the key finding is that, yes, we think they do. The bargaining power is much higher for financial investors, but then they're a much smaller group in New South Wales versus Victoria. They're not purely financial investors. There's a lot of blending between farmers who don't own any land but own water. You know, they might be retired, for example, and other without use categories. So, you know, it's part of the difference when you're doing studies like this is, especially within the Australian water market, is all the different coding, the different data, the different access, the different water rights. But so all in all, even though we're finding estimates of potential bargaining power, we don't know for sure. Is it due to imperfect competition? Is it due to information asymmetry? Is it due to transaction frictions? It's probably all of these things. But if I had to guess, I would say that one of the most important ones is probably information asymmetry in terms of financial investors having a lot more access to different resources and time and knowledge to be able to try and, when they're selling, for example, to get the best price. So, the results really do support the ACCC water market reforms that have been implemented, and they continue to be implemented over time. And, also trying to work out how to reduce information asymmetry, especially for small family farms within the Murray-Darling Basin, I think is very important to help them use water markets more so, or to make better use of water markets as an adaptation tool going forward. So thank you very much for listening, and we're happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Alex. That's really a wonderful presentation. I mean, water market is really a heated debate in the field, taking place in many different countries. You mentioned Australia. I think water economists in Chile, in California, they also have, similar experiences. Let's open up for Q&A. I see Marcella. Marcella, please, you can unmute yourself and go ahead with your question.
So thank you, Sarah and Alec, for the great presentation. I really enjoyed it. My name is Marcela Brugnach. I'm sitting in the Basque Country. I am a professor at the Basque Climate Change Center. I've never been in Australia, and I'm not an economist. So my question comes from that background. And I was curious I work with social systems, and by listening to your presentations, I was curious about the homogenization that is done in terms of water users in the questions you presented. And I was given the history of colonization in Australia and the difference perhaps between natives and non-native population, how the bargain power is changed. I mean, you treat it as in terms of water used and climate variables and water uses, but does this positionality of people could act differently based on the histories, how does it taken into account? I think this could affect a lot the bargain power. That's my question. If that is so, yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're absolutely right in terms of, how water rights were given out in the very beginning does determine, how the control people have, the wealth they accumulate, the knowledge they get, etc. So that's why water markets, when we talk about some of the distributional issues of water markets in Australia, we took water away from First Nations and we took power away from them. And if we could go back in time, should Australia done it differently? Of course. But looking forward from now, one interesting thing is water markets are now being used to try and give some of those water rights back to First Nations. So, there's $100 million being invested by our national government to buy water entitlements for First Nation groups. And for anyone who knows anything about the Murray-Darling Basin plan, it's up for review next year. And the big thing, environment will still be a major focus about how do we get environment more sustainable. But the idea of cultural water rights is really going to rise to the fore And, you know, in that sense, water markets will be used to help rectify some of the distributional problems and issues that occurred. It's far from perfect, but we can't go back in time, but we can use water markets now to try and rectify some of that damage.
How do you see that under climate change and increasing drought conditions?
Well, that's where the environmental side. So, you know, if I had my way, people wouldn't want me to have my way, but I would basically, where it comes to allocations, I would slash allocations across the board for everyone. No compensation, but Australia has chosen a different path. And part of also slashing allocations would be to give out water rights using the water market, using other methods that the government has, increase water rights back to First Nation groups.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you, Marcela. Muchas gracias. Yeah.
De nada, de
Yes.
nada.
Yeah, we have Emma. Please go ahead, Emma.
Hello. Thank you, Marcela. That was a really interesting question. I hope my connection is fine because I've had some issues. I am based in South Africa. I work at a local consulting firm that works on climate change, adaptation issues, and sustainable development. And I'm also doing my master's at UCT. I just wanted to go back to the results where you talk about groundwater salinity. I couldn't quite catch that. So, what were your results with regards to groundwater salinity? Higher salinity. So, okay, based on what I read, are you saying that higher salinity reduces bargaining power because buyers switch to groundwater? Is that correct?
Yes, or don't potentially. Oh, Alec, do you want to take this one, or I can answer it?
Alex, you muted.
This is relative difference of salinity, groundwater salinity between seller and buyer. So if seller over buyer have a relatively higher salinity, then it's more likely so buyer would have a relatively lower groundwater salinity. And because groundwater and surface water in some areas of the basin, irrigators can switch between them. So it's more likely for buyers to switch to groundwater because it's cheaper, or if they don't have enough surface water. And then if buyers switch to groundwater, then their demand for surface water would be lower, and then this would make sellers have less bargaining power over buyer because of demand. So this is all relative because there are two forces at play, and then because we have observed a negative coefficient here, and then that's why we infer that it's the demand side at play more than the supply side.
Okay.
Do you want to add anything, Sarah?
Yeah. No, just apart from the general thing that groundwater and surface water demand, especially in Victoria, they can be substitutes. And so irrigators, right, so I didn't actually talk about this because this is another facet of water markets, but to the extent where irrigators have access to groundwater resources, right? And depending on some of those groundwater resources can be highly saline or others can be reasonable quality, but they have to pay diesel pumping to get the water up out of the ground, and they still have to have a right to extract that groundwater. But in times of drought, when they've got very low water allocation, so their surface water allocation is very low, and if they want to go on the market to get extra water, if that's, say, the middle of a drought and we're talking $900 a megalitre, then switching to groundwater is much more feasible. So there's a trade-off. So irrigators are constantly juggling different trade-offs in sort of what water they're going to use and how and when, and what are the prices, what are the, you know, surface water, it's either their allocation percentage, prices on the market. Groundwater, it's like prices of pumping and access and the quality of that groundwater. So it's these are factors that all come into play over irrigators' water use and how, where and when they're using it. And groundwater salinity is just another kind of locational factor that shows, in terms of bargaining power, it actually can influence prices within the market between sellers and buyers.
Right. Yeah, I understand perfectly now. Thanks so much. So I understand that sellers can also sell their groundwater. And do they have different like rights with regards to their like surface water and their groundwater?
Yes, yes, they do. I mean, generally they will own more surface water than groundwater, and they're in different trading zones. So, you know, when I showed you that figure of the trading zones, that was surface water trading zones. Groundwater trading zones are different. So again, it depends about where it can, where water can move to. But irrigators are still making that choice about what sort of water resources they have, where they can sell it, what's the trade-off on use, what's the quality they need. I mean, the other thing I haven't said is that there are some irrigators in the Southern Basin where they have highly saline groundwater resources that aren't suitable to be applied on crops because it will reduce their productivity or kill them. Some of them are even thinking about putting in like very small desalination plants and things like that. That's what's currently being investigated in some areas now. So that, and people would say, oh, well, that's hugely expensive. But if we come back to Marcelia's point about climate change and the future, in the future, desalination, there potentially will be more small desal plants, even more mixing high salinity groundwater resources with surface water. So then your water is not as salty. That sort of trend will continue within the basin.
Thank you. That was all really, really interesting. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Emma, and thanks, Sarah and Alec, for the answers. We have a question on the chat from Garrido. Before we go to Matthew, I'm reading it here. Thanks for your time and work. Let me go straight to the question. Were you able to I think he meant especially disaggregate your input data, let's say monthly allocation rate or traded volumes at different MBD subcatchments? Literally, I think the question is whether you guys, you were in a position to disaggregate the data and to look at what's going to happen, you know, between or within subcatchments in the basin. And the question proceeded, like Namoi or Guidir, or even into local level agreements like Liverpool Plains, and hence obtain specially disaggregated findings? That's the question from Jesus Garrido Rubio.
Alec, do you want to answer this one?
Yeah.
If I flip back to data?
Yes, I answered there in the chat, but we have the locations. We can have subgroups, subsamples for specific catchments. But because our differences variables between seller and buyer relies on like differences in their rainfall temperature observations and groundwater salinity. So that's why we want this to have a relatively higher variation. If it's only within the same catchment, then we would observe very, very small differences between their temperature allocation percentage and also groundwater salinity. So it may not have any results, statistic power to detect the differences, but in terms of ownership differences, there might be some differences for each sub catchments. Yeah, but we haven't tried that.
Thanks,
No.
Ale. Please go ahead, Sarah. You wanted to add something?
Oh, no, I was just agreeing.
Okay, Matthew, over to you.
Thanks for the interesting presentation. I'm from Gauteng, South Africa. I was interested in the slide on ownership specifically. I see the financial investor one has a lower number, like less than 1% in one, the seller and the buyer. Would there be rules against that? I'm assuming this is just purely for speculative purposes, where they're not really going to use the water for anything industrial or anything like that. It's just purely for speculative. Would there be rules to guard against that? Or the reason it's low, it might be just a financial reason. And I see with the two states, one completely doesn't have any financial investor ownership. Would there be a reason for that? Thanks.
Yeah, I can answer it, Alec. So, yeah, so this comes down to quite different scenarios in states about how they control their water and, you know, how legislation and institutions have developed over time and the lack of consistency in terminology and how everything, and this is why you have over 154 different water entitlements in the basin, because you've got these differences in states. So New South Wales, so when they coded that trade data for us, so they have information obviously on who the person is, what they're using the water for, what type of license it is, etc. So their use of and their coding of water market data is the most applicable to the question that we were trying to look at as to non-use landholders impact their bargaining power within water markets. But financial investors, as you can see, of our 23,000 trades, they only made up a very small amount of temporary trade. So 1% of seller and 3% of buyer. All right. So in terms of, they are still selling and buying potentially within the market. There are rules and regulations that govern all water market trades, and financial investors are, it applies to them as well. A lot of them, we've done a study to say, this is a study by my PhD student a few years ago, treating water like stock markets. So it's quite an interesting paper if you're interested in knowing more about how non-traditional stakeholders participate in the market and why. We don't think that financial investors and people who participate in water markets like this, it's not going to grow hugely, because you still have to have a lot of water knowledge and a lot of knowledge about how water markets work to actually make a lot of money in this space. And to be frank, water brokers or stock market traders are often better just going in the normal stock market, because they can make returns there a lot easier and faster than trading water in water markets. So that's one thing I'd like to make comments about in terms of that financial investor category. And then the Victorian one, as Alec mentioned, so without use is our closest category to financial investors and to non-irrigators holding water in that state, right? But it owns water that's not tied to irrigation land. The thing is, that's, you know, if we look at sellers, they make up 41% of sales of trade. A lot of that is, for example, retired farmers. So a lot of farmers, since unbundling, they will keep their water entitlement. They might hand over their property to their son or their daughter, because, you know, it's good that daughters take over farming land nowadays. But they don't hand over their water entitlements, and that's their kind of retirement, and then they trade with that. All right, so but that's now a without use category. So that's why the without use category in Victoria, because it's not a pure financial investor category, it's a lot bigger and broader. And that's also why we see really less bargaining power associated with that category than we do with our financial investor category in New South Wales. So I know this makes it very hard to kind of explain when you've got all these different terminology in different states, but we kind of debated whether we should only like show New South Wales results in our paper to keep it more simple. But we felt we had to show both results to show that, you know, it's a complex situation, and you know, just having a without use category is not the same as a purely financial investor category. So I hope that explains it a little bit better.
Great, thank you, Sarah. This was really an insightful talk.